This is the Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, featuring Nikolas Gvosdev, Tatiana Serafin, and Paul Saunders. This episode was recorded on September 1st, 2021.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at the Carnegie Council.
We're really looking forward to our conversation today with Paul Saunders, the President of the Energy Innovation Reform Project and a Senior Fellow on U.S. Foreign Policy at the Center for the National Interest, who also served as a Senior Advisor to Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky. Will be talking with us about matters related to South Asia, ASEAN, economics, and energy. But first, turning it over to my co-host for important stories that you may have missed.
Well, I think, Nick, and we'll talk about this more with Paul, not a lot of people were talking about Vice President Harris's trip to Singapore and Vietnam. It got some coverage, but mostly because people wanted to hear what she said about Afghanistan and our pullout. But why was she in Singapore? Why was she in Vietnam? It was to cooperate and create links economically over vaccines and other issues to create stronger ties to a region that President Biden has made an area of focus, Asia and the Asia Pacific region. So I wanted to talk a little bit about her trip because it's so interesting for our listeners here at the Doorstep. She was there in part, one of the things she did in Hanoi was to open an office for the CDC. I don't think, maybe we realize that the CDC actually has a lot of international outposts. Did you realize that, Nick?
It's not something that I keep in the back of my mind. I usually think of the CDC as a domestic agency, but again, this goes back to our earlier Doorstep with Peter Sands about how we're all interconnected. Diseases don't recognize borders, and oftentimes the best defense at home starts with an overseas presence. But I think we don't think of that as we should, because we think of this as a domestic issue, but often what we're doing overseas is the first barrier before something gets here. So I think it's an important reminder about why these foreign trips matter to people in their day-to-day lives.
And it was also important because she was there to announce a donation of 1 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine to Vietnam, in fact, which is only 2% vaccinated, which is, if I'm sitting here in New York and we're at 75%, and I think when I saw 2%, I was really shocked. But before she was able to make her announcement, the Chinese got in there with their own announcement of a donation of vaccines to Vietnam. Why do you think that happened?
Well, it's the use of vaccines as tools of influence, of saying, well, who would you rather partner with? Who would you rather be aligned with? And I think that this question of competition really comes up with these vaccines, but also that this isn't altruism purely on either China's part or on America's part, because an unvaccinated workforce is a workforce that gets sick. And as we've discussed with Peter, as we'll discuss with Paul, as we've discussed with other guests on the Doorstep, with interconnected supply chains, you have a slowdown because people are sick, and it manifests itself. Something we posted on the Doorstep Twitter page a few days ago is how a combination of a upsurge in COVID cases and shipping bottlenecks means that all across this country, people who are going into their coffee shops and wanting to get plastic cups of ice are finding that there are shortages of plastic cups. So again, giving vaccines to Vietnam is part of a recognition that we need countries like Vietnam to be part of these supply chains, and that Vietnamese who are getting sick aren't going to work. And if they're not going to work and goods aren't being produced, then sooner or later, like the butterfly effect, we feel it here.
Also, I want to say, to add to that, it's also part of China being very aggressive in its diplomacy with the United States, something we call wolf warrior diplomacy, something on September 23rd, we will be talking about with our special guest in our next book talk. And so I want to also remind our audience to please join us for China's Civilian Army with Peter Martin on September 23rd. Look us up on our Doorstep page for more information about that event, where we'll be exploring this more. And we've seen it right here today, or it was last week, but an example of this wolf warrior diplomacy in action. The other thing in action that happened over there that I think we need to talk about is before Vice President Harris was able to go to Singapore to Hanoi, her trip was delayed because of an instance of the Havana syndrome potentially being explored. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that is, Nick, and why it's coming up now and why it's been under the radar?
Yeah, Havana syndrome refers to an outbreak of cases in our embassy in Cuba, dating back several years, where people working at the embassy were reporting headaches, they were reporting other health issues, and the concern has been, is this something that is caused by sonic devices that are deliberately set to incapacitate and injure people, with the understanding that this was targeting or meant to target people who were thought to be intelligence personnel. But of course, there's no way for these devices to distinguish who people are or what their jobs are in an embassy. But the question here is, again, this gets at this point of ways in which countries compete and ways in which countries seek to inflict damage on each other. And in this case, are we starting to see more cases where people are being targeted? U.S. officials are being targeted by competitor countries that are using these kinds of tools as a way to pressure and as a way to try to encourage people, perhaps for the U.S. perhaps to pull back or not be as involved. So it's a very interesting development, something that I think we're still trying to get our hands around in understanding the causes and also trying to figure out what are ways in which we can defend against this. But again, this is part of this, as you mentioned, wolf warrior diplomacy. This is another way of trying to push back against U.S. engagement and to try to, in this case, make the stakes for engagement very personal with people by saying that you are perhaps going to risk injury or a health condition by being part of America's forward presence in other parts of the world.
Super, super scary. And I think we will be hearing more about it. Just this summer, the Senate passed the Havana Act, which was a bipartisan effort to look into the causes and the targets. And hopefully we'll be seeing more information about that in the news in the coming months. Before we go to Paul Saunders, who I'm so excited to speak to, I want to give a shout out to all the Paralympians in Tokyo. Good luck. We go till September 5th. So please watch them. It is just as important as the Olympics. With that, I can't wait. Let's start.
Well, thank you for joining us, Paul. And I think that this is really good timing in that while we've focused so much of our attention on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we have not really paid as much attention to the dynamics of what's happening in the rest of Asia. The vice president makes a trip to the region, which was supposed to be the beginnings of the Biden-Harris pivot or rebalance to Asia, and almost no coverage of that. And so just opening it up to start with you, your sense of the vice president's visit. Was anything achieved? What signals does this send to our friends and partners in the region about our our commitment. Certainly, some of the issues that were on the table prior to the withdrawal from Afghanistan for the region was very much not just simply the rise of China, but also concerns about supply chains and energy and so on and so forth. So is all of this just on hold while we figure out Afghanistan? What's happening? If you can give us a sense of your take on what's going on in the region and what's happening with the U.S. approach.
No, absolutely. Thanks very much, Nick and Tatiana. It's really a pleasure to be with you both here today. Look, I think the most important thing about the vice president's trip to the region is that she went. Symbolically, I think that sends a very important signal about the U.S. interest and the U.S. Stake in ASEAN, this kind of 10-country group, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and a number of others, Singapore, that many Americans are familiar with. It's a region that often doesn't really get the attention it deserves. So Indonesia in particular, I'd point to as, a highly populous, increasingly important economically country. But certainly a number of others that are quite important to the United States. Vietnam, a complex relationship, obviously, but an increasingly important one strategically, also economically, as we see many supply chains kind of coming out of China and going to other places. Vietnam, certainly a big beneficiary of that. I think quite important for the vice president to have visited. I wouldn't call the trip certainly a game changer or anything like that. It's the diplomacy like this is kind of typically measured in incremental progress rather than dramatic breakthroughs. But I think it is quite important that she went. There are a number of agreements that were signed and understandings reached, and we'll see over time how important all of that is. But certainly an important step forward.
And if I could, Paul, just earlier this year, the Energy Innovation Reform Project had released a pretty groundbreaking report about an energy partnership between the United States and its partners in this part of the world. It really was forward-looking about how do we both, begin to transition away from hydrocarbons, but also how do we keep the energy flowing that powers our economies, powers these supply chains that produce the goods that many of us are consuming as we speak. Any sense from this trip that any part of the agenda that you laid out in that report earlier this year was acted on, or that foundations were laid?
Well, certainly I think that foundations laid, I think that's the right way to look at it. Clean energy is clearly a very high priority for the Biden administration. There's been a lot of dialogue and engagement with others around those issues. And certainly if you look, both at ASEAN, but just at the wider Indo-Pacific region, it's been a very major focus of our efforts. I think for ASEAN in particular, there are real challenges. It's a region that depends still quite heavily on coal for power generation. And there's a fairly clear reason for that, which is, it's cheap. and these are, developing countries. And when they make decisions about their energy systems, they have to consider, not only their, clean energy and climate goals, but their ability to provide reliable electricity to their people, their ability to provide access to electricity to people, and certainly, there are kind of varying levels of access across this region, but there are definitely some countries where there is not universal access to electricity. And they have to think about, affordability. And then they have to balance all of that against the other investments that they need to make in other development areas, health, education, many other fields. So it's a big challenge. They continue to rely heavily in many cases, most cases, on coal. And I think it will be very important for the United States moving forward to try to look for ways to help all of them to move toward cleaner electricity. And, that may mean moving to other kinds of electricity generation. It may mean in some cases using carbon capture and storage, together with coal to reduce the emissions.
I think it's not only energy when we look at the region, but also what's fascinating for our listeners, for our Doorstep listeners, is that, and we spoke about this, Paul, there are about 42,000 US companies, last statistic I have, that export to the 10 countries in ASEAN. So that is businesses at home doing business with a part of the world that, depending on which countries you include in South Asia, Southeast Asia, occupy a third of the planet. So that's, nearly 3 billion, 2.5 billion people that are your potential customers. And also, as you mentioned, the supply to the United States. Vietnam has certainly been a great textile supplier in recent years for us. And I think that this is so important for our listeners to understand, why there might be a pivot, if you want to call that internally, if you believe there's a pivot to Asia, or why we need to be discussing this area more. I think traditionally we've looked at some of these destinations as just holiday destinations, right? Bali, Thailand.
Right.
But in fact, there is a lot of economic activity, not just in energy, but in a lot of different fields and in a lot of supply chain fields. And I think that's what Vice President Harris was trying to support and indicate, particularly in Vietnam, negotiating some of the strategic business partnerships, but it got lost. The messaging got lost. I know it got lost because there was another big news story out there, but is there something else that's getting lost in translation? What can we do to make our audience, our listeners, make this a doorstep issue, make people really understand the economic importance of this region?
Sure. Well, look, you're absolutely right, Tatiana. It's a huge market. It's a growing market because many of these countries are really taking off. We've talked a number of times already about Vietnam, but Vietnam is one that is really in the process of moving up the value chain. You mentioned the textile exports, but as we see some kinds of manufacturing, moving out of China and looking for other homes, I think we've increasingly seen Vietnam, benefit from that in terms of kind of increasingly technologically advanced manufacturing. And actually, as surprising as it may seem, for Americans, having lower cost labor actually than China as well. So there is, this big economic question, and I think there are a lot of American firms that are, increasingly looking to the region both as a source of supply and also as a destination for exports. The other thing we have to remember about this region as we look back historically, but also think about the future is, it's a region that really sits directly in the middle of the kind of key shipping lanes from the Middle East to East Asia. So, people frequently will talk about the Straits of Malacca, for example, as kind of a key, transportation choke point in between these two kind of critical global regions. And the global energy transition, we don't really know how fast that's going to go, how it's going to play out, what the technologies of the future will be. And, certainly for the past and decades into the future, the ability to move oil and gas kind of quickly, safely, and cheaply from the Middle East to East Asia is going to be really critical to the global economy. There's just no question. And disruptions in that ability, they're going to affect Americans and everybody else very directly by increasing the costs, of these global commodities, particularly in the case of oil. And, looking to natural gas, we have a number of countries in East Asia, and I would especially single out Japan and South Korea that are really seeing their own energy futures, focusing increasingly on hydrogen power as a source of kind of clean burning fuel. But one of the principal sources of that hydrogen is going to be natural gas with carbon capture. As it looks today, at any rate, we'll see how things shape up. So those supply lines, probably remaining very, very important into the future.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we recently did a whole podcast on shipping and how shipping may bring back the concept of globalization, or the euphoria, at least, over an interconnected world that seemed to have been lost a little bit during the pandemic when everybody became very isolated. But really, to your point, we are all interconnected, and the shipping lanes and certainly those seas are very important. So maybe a shift now to talk about our military presence in the oceans there, and what we're doing, because I think that's also perhaps not covered as it should be. Are we increasing our presence over in the South China Seas? What's going on? I know there's been some aggressive tactics by China. Can either of you comment on that?
Well, Nick, I would really defer to you on naval matters, but it's very clearly an area of increased focus for the United States, and an area of increased concern. And actually, if we look back at history, which often is useful. Our role in World War II in Asia had a great deal to do with precisely the issues that we're talking about right now. People may not remember, but of course, at the time, Imperial Japan in the 1930s had occupied much of China and was pushing kind of southward toward, present day Vietnam and Southeast Asia. The United States objected to that and imposed economic sanctions on Japan, primarily in the form of an oil embargo, because at the time we were a very major oil exporter and a very major source of oil for Japan. And the Japanese response to that, rather than kind of giving in to our pressure in the way that many Americans hoped at the time, was to take the view that actually what they really needed to do was to control the oil resources in kind of Indonesia, Malaysia regions, which were also important sources of oil at that time, and continue to be oil producers today. And the only way that Imperial Japan could do that on a sustainable basis was to try to take the U.S. Navy out of the equation in the Pacific for as long as they could. And there's a kind of a straight line to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, I certainly don't expect and would strenuously hope that we avoid, anything similar to that in the future. But these are precisely the questions and precisely the issues that contributed to that conflict. Now I guess 75 years ago, we just celebrated the 75th anniversary of the end of the war.
Well, Paul, that raises an interesting point that you're making there, and this perhaps ties to this larger question of the impact of Afghanistan, because this week, former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien seemed to suggest that one of the silver linings of the end of the mission in Afghanistan is the ability to redistribute resources and to think about kind of the greater Indo-Pacific basin, and particularly, as you said, the supply lines, securing the supply chains, making sure that energy is flowing, is all of that is taking place. On the other hand, people have been raising the question, does the way that the United States left Afghanistan create doubt or raise questions among allies and partners in that part of the world as to America's sustainability to be able to kind of do the heavy lifting? Is there any sense you're getting from your contacts, from people that you've been working with on these projects, that they have a shadow of doubt about whether or not the U.S. is prepared to do some of the heavy lifting for creating, as Tatiana said, creating and maintaining this infrastructure that connects us together? Or does this, again, open up the door of, well, perhaps we ought to be reaching some sort of accommodation with China?
Well, that's a really complex set of questions, Nick, and I think certainly from my own conversations, I think it's clear that a number of people in allied nations have real questions and concerns about how the administration handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And there are two separate questions here, really. One question is, should the United States have remained in Afghanistan longer? And if so, how long and in what way? And, with what level of commitment? Or, should we have withdrawn? That's kind of one debate. And then, of course, there's another debate kind of around the specific execution of the withdrawal by the Biden administration and the president's determination to adhere to the August 31st deadline. Decisions like the decision to, evacuate the Bagram Air Base base prior to evacuating Kabul and the international airport there, rather than perhaps afterward. There are a variety of other things that I think could have been done differently. For many of our allies, another really big question, relates to consultation, and this is sort of less relevant for many of our allies in Asia, who were not really involved to the same extent as our European allies in Afghanistan. But certainly I think many of our European allies are quite disturbed by the level of consultation. And, this has been in the press, it's not a particular secret, officials in a number of NATO allied countries have been quite critical, actually, of the timing, the process, and particularly from their perspective, the lack of consultation. And we've even seen, specifically in the case of the British and the US relationship, kind of this sniping really surrounding the terrorist attack outside the airport, and US officials reportedly saying in briefings to others that that happened in part because they had left this gate open longer to accommodate some British nationals who the British military was bringing back into the airport, and the British kind of disputing that. So, we've kind of reached a level in some of these relationships where, there are these battles over assigning blame, which is not a desirable situation to be in if the real goal of disengaging from this conflict was to allow us to focus on other challenges. And I think it's kind of indisputable, as the president said, that kind of any complete withdrawal from Afghanistan was going to be messy. The question is kind of how messy did it have to be, and did it have to be as messy as it was? Again, as you highlighted in your question there, with what consequences for not only for Afghanistan and all of the people who we were trying to get out, and most of whom we did get out, but many of whom we didn't, and also for the way that others around the world look at us. And my sense is that very few of our allies see it as our finest hour.
Not just our allies, I think. I'm just wanted to bring it back to, and Nick mentioned China. How about Russia? I mean, Biden also made a point of saying that China and Russia are our biggest focuses in terms of their power positions in the world. Does our messiness in Afghanistan give an opening to them to somehow undermine our efforts in Asia or in other places around the world, but by kind of saying, well, look what they've done. They're going to leave you too, or America's finest hour is over. Any sense of that happening, particularly with reference to Russia and China?
I think it's a really good question. It's very clear that Chinese and Russian officials already have done their utmost to convey precisely the message that you described there, Tatiana, that America is finished, America is unreliable, America is incompetent. We've seen a great deal of that over the last couple of weeks, and I expect that we'll see a lot more of it going forward. And it's going to be certainly a challenge for the administration to overcome that. And it's going to be even more challenging, I think, with some of our European allies for the reasons that I just talked about, but because there really, I think, will be some lingering ill will over what occurred. Obviously, we're still allies, and we have a lot of shared interests and everything else, but it is really a self-inflicted wound that will make everything that the administration wants to do, I expect, more challenging. I think we can be sure that Chinese and Russian officials will be conveying this message not only in public, but also, in their private meetings with our allies and with others, in the region. So that is going to be a tough one. That is going to be a tough one.
We talked and we look a lot at China in the region. Certainly it's obvious what the interests of China are in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But what are Russia's interests there for our listeners, and why should we be worried about Russia in that region? Any thoughts?
Well, I think historically East Asia has not really had, or Southeast Asia for that matter, has not really had the priority for Russia that some other regions have had. And if you look at Russian official strategy documents or foreign policy and security documents, the foreign policy concept, the military doctrine, the national security strategy, other things like that, you generally see, Europe really front and center. You see Central Asia certainly front and center. The Middle East, perhaps not as high a priority as the other two, but an increasingly important region for Russia, particularly now with the ongoing operations in Syria. And Asia, has often been, at least until recently, was often really kind of secondary. I think we've seen in recent years, greater and greater and greater priority put onto the Russia-China relationship. And at the same time, we see at various times kind of these interesting signals or suggestions, perhaps, that Russia is also trying to balance a little bit China itself in various ways. We see sometimes, I think, some signs of that in the Russia-Japan relationship. We've talked a lot about Vietnam, but I would say, we also see at times some evidence of that in the Russia-Vietnam relationship, obviously with China and Vietnam, having a kind of a history of tension and having fought their own war, I guess about 40 years ago now, in the aftermath of the US war in Vietnam. So I think for Russia, the main stake really today is an economic one, as opportunities for Russia to get investment, to get high technology, from the United States or from other Western countries are constrained. I think Russia is looking increasingly to Asia for those things, certainly to China, but, certainly also to Japan and Korea. And Russia is also looking, for markets, of course, for certainly its natural gas exports, for its arms exports, for nuclear power plants. Russia actually, in the latter case of nuclear power, it's recently done something a little bit novel in building this academic Lomonosov floating nuclear power plant. It's just a big ship with a couple of nuclear reactors on it. It kind of left the shipyard a while ago and has gone out to the Russian Far East. It's kind of the northern, the Arctic coastline, but in the Far East, it's a town called Pevek, which is a coastal town in that part of Russia. And it's kind of hooked up to the electric grid and providing power. And the reason that I mention this is that I think there is an idea among some that systems like this actually could be very attractive for a number of kind of developing countries with long coastlines, and it's something that one would not necessarily need to buy, but might be able to sort of rent or lease or something to provide power on a kind of short term, compared to the life of a nuclear power plant. But perhaps, for several years or something, as countries kind of have expanding demand and maybe not all of the infrastructure that they need to support it. So there are a lot of different, I think, interests that Russia can have really across a broad range of issues.
It's fascinating, Paul, to hear you discuss all of this, because I keep coming back to a previous Doorstep guest, Carolyn Kissan from NYU, and her concept of climate statecraft, that in the end, all of these issues begin to collapse back into each other, the geopolitics, the energy, the economic, and that this really is the shape of things perhaps to come. The countries are going to look for the partners that will not only make them secure, but will help them in their energy and economic needs, and to do so in a cleaner fashion moving forward. So I think this is a really dynamic moment that we're seeing, particularly in the U.S. Outreach to Southeast Asia, with all of these elements coming in, but that also other countries are able or are trying to compete in the same way.
No, absolutely. I think there's really a lot going on here, and at least to my mind, technology has increasingly become the ground on which we will compete. With China, with Russia, and actually, for that matter, with our allies, because this is fundamentally economic and We're in economic competition with our allies as well as with our rivals. We certainly see, maybe stepping outside of the energy space, artificial intelligence, other kinds of computing, robotics, biotechnology. I think we increasingly see this effort by states to pour resources into these areas, and we see increasingly statements by leaders and politicians kind of reflecting the idea that these are the things that are going to shape the future. I expect in no small part, because the rate of technological change has accelerated to such an extent that the consequences, of being left behind, in one of these major transitions could be quite serious. Certainly Vladimir Putin, to the extent that people read his statements, he's spoken actually quite forcefully on this topic. If we don't succeed in these areas, we'll be left behind, and that'll be the end of it. He's been, I think, quite explicit about that, and I expect that leaders in a number of other countries feel the same way. Now, of course, there are only a relatively small number of countries compared to the 190 or whatever countries in the world that are able to compete in many of these areas, and some of them are only able to compete in perhaps a few select ones rather than across all of them. And I think that's something from my point of view that really drives home the importance of the engagement and the partnerships. And, it's not just kind of developing countries that have to be careful about how they spend their money. It's the United States and others too. And that kind of engagement is also just a really terrific way to leverage our resources and to kind of apply shared effort to common goals. So I see those kinds of partnership and that engagement as really critical in all of this too. It's not easy to execute for the reason actually that I just mentioned. Even where our allies are concerned, we're economic competitors, right? So coming up with the right formula that allows us to work closely with allies on R&D in key areas, and doing that while kind of managing these competitive economic tensions. I think it'll be very challenging, but I see it as really a kind of a central area of our future diplomacy, and I hope our imminent present day diplomacy, because it's just such a key issue.
I think that is such a great way to end our conversation today, that we need global engagement. And this area, South Asia and Southeast Asia, is such an important area for us to remember and to consider, and especially as Vice President Harris was just there. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to be with you both.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.